Welcome to our channel, where we bring the most bone-chilling stories from the depths of Reddit's darkest corners. Join us as we explore the eerie tales that keep you up at night. If you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notifications to never miss a spine-tingling story. Almost as soon as the note and photo tumbled out of that FedEx envelope, two things happened in rapid succession. The first was that I immediately dashed over to the wall-mounted TV and clambered for the plug, yanking it out of the wall outlet hard enough to let out a small spark. For a moment, I stared at the small inset camera mounted at the top of the frame, one I'd previously regarded with joy and intrigue, as I'd used it to video call friends and family who lived across the country. Now, though, it reminded me more of something out of a dystopian horror novel. The second thing that happened was I called the cops. Despite how my previous interaction with them, especially the detective, had gone, I dialed 911 anyways. This time I had proof that couldn't be simply deleted out from under my nose. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. While I waited for them to arrive, I kept both the photo and note clutched tightly in my hand. I'd seen far too many films where physical proof had been left lying around, only to have it swiped away when the authorities arrived. Like hell, that's happening here. A few minutes later, I saw the two police cruisers pull up to the curb, and I opened the door. Just like with the detective, they treated my story with an understandable sense of skepticism. At first, their expressions changed when I held out the two items I'd received in the mail. After looking at them and sharing a look, they began to take me far more seriously. Many phone calls and radio transmissions were made, and half an hour later, the same detective I'd dealt with before, whose name I learned was Detective Monkhouse, had shown up as well. "This is very serious," he said, looking up from the now bagged and tagged note and photo at me. "Digital hacking and privacy invasion is a crime, but it's one which can be very hard to track back down to the suspect, Mr. Wexler." I looked up at him from across my kitchen table, hearing the voices of other officers in my living room as members of the cybercrime forensics team examined the television. "So what are you telling me?" I asked, a note of anxiety audible in my voice. "That you're not going to be able to find whoever is doing this to me?" He shook his head. "That's not what I'm saying, Mr. Wexler. Not entirely, at least." He held his hands out. "There are many different types of cybercriminals. Everything from amateurs who leave behind a digital paper trail you can observe from the space station, to some of the most knowledgeable black hats who rarely, if ever, get caught. We need to find out which category this individual or group of individuals are in. We may be able to find them." He gave me a look of sympathy. "But then again, we may not." I felt my shoulders slump at his words, and my head lowered down to look at the wooden table. "However," I heard him say, "we are going to try our best to find them. If our own local cybercrime unit can't get any headway, since this seems to be beyond just a normal intrusion, we'll reach out to some of the bigger authorities for help." I looked back up and nodded. A uniformed officer, one with a gray goatee, stuck his head into the kitchen. "Detective, the forensics team have finished their overview. They weren't able to find any way the photo had been taken here. They're asking if they have permission to take it back to the lab for further study." Detective Monkhouse shot me a look. I waved my hand at him. "Take the damn thing! As far as I'm concerned, keep it and lock it up in an evidence locker somewhere forever. I don't want it in my house anymore." He nodded at me, then nodded to the officer, who disappeared back into the living room. I saw him reach into the inner pocket of his coat, pulling out a card and placing it in the middle of the table. "This has my personal cell number, Mr. Wexler. If anything, and I do mean anything else, shows up, be it physical or on your phone." I cut him off. "I got rid of my smartphone, Detective." I held up the flip phone which had been on the table beside me. He cocked his head in surprise, then nodded. "Well, regardless, get in touch with me if anything else happens," he said. I nodded, then thought of something. "What about in the meantime?" I asked him as he stood up from the table. He scratched his head. "Well, for a few days, I'll have a squad car placed on the street in front of your house. It's unlikely these people will actually make a physical move on you, especially now that you've called us, but It'll be erring on the side of caution." I nodded, letting out a sigh of relief before thanking him. He waved me away and began to follow the other officers, two carrying my TV out to a forensics van before turning back in the doorway. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you at first, Mr. Wexler," he admitted. I dismissed him with a wave of my own. "You couldn't have known," I admitted. After giving me a final hard look, he nodded, then closed the front door behind him. I was left alone in the silence, which now seemed almost suffocating after the events of the evening. As I thought of something to do to help get my mind off of things, something flashed into my mind. I had two smart TVs, one which the police had taken, and a second up in my bedroom, which faced directly at my bed. Before the thought had even finished in my mind, I was dashing up the stairs and into my bedroom, crashing through the half-open door. It sat on top of my dresser, dark and silent. For a moment, I thought about letting it be. After all, the photo had come from the downstairs TV, not this one. Nope, I'm not taking any chances here, I thought as I crossed to it and pulled the power plug from the wall. I unhooked the cable and Blu-ray connectors, then carried it downstairs and out the front door, where I dumped it on the sidewalk next to the trash bins. The next day, as I had the weekend off of work, I drove to my local Goodwill and purchased two old TVs. Both were the old, boxy CRT sets, too old to have any way to have someone spy on me through them. I brought them back home and was setting them up when my landline rang. I answered, hearing Davin's voice on the other end. "Jared, what the heck happened at your place? Molly was driving by last night and she saw a couple cop cars out front." I began to open my mouth to tell him, but stopped. I'd known Davin for almost 7 years now, as long as I'd worked for the company. I'd trusted him completely. Hell, the man had even invited me to his wedding. But, at the same time, I had no idea who was doing this to me. It could be someone many miles away, or it could be someone much closer to home. The feeling that I couldn't trust anyone was one I'd never had before, and I didn't like it. Still, I kept my cards close to the vest. "Some homeless guy tried breaking into my house through the backyard, that's all," I lied, trying as hard as I could to sound casual. "Oh," was all he said, a small moment of silence spreading out between us. For a moment, I thought he'd clicked off before he spoke again. "Anyways, some of the office were talking, and we thought about having an afternoon lunch tomorrow at Chang's in the mall. You want to come?" I debated on it for the moment, then nodded my head at no one. "It'd be good for you to get out of here for a bit after this." "Sure, why not?" I said. "Great, I'll let them know you'll be coming," he said enthusiastically, before bidding me goodnight. I hung the phone up on its hook, then shook my head and went back to setting up the new TVs. The next day, I walked out to my car at about noon. I saw the squad car on the other side of the street and raised an arm to wave to them. They did the same, seeing I was leaving, and I saw one radio it in. Climbing into my car, I started the engine and backed out of my driveway. I decided I'd take a couple back roads instead of the main ones. Not only would it save me some time, it'd also give me a chance to admire the beautiful trees and lakes on the way. I was happy to see very few cars also taking the road. As I passed an old farmhouse, the red barn and silos glinting in the light, my car's dash let out a little ring. I looked at it, feeling a bit confused as I saw the notification I had an incoming call displayed on the screen. The hell? My flip phone has no Bluetooth and I don't have anything else paired to it. Feeling a slight sense of uneasiness fall over me, I looked closer and saw Davin's name pop up on the caller ID. I reached out with my thumb and, after a moment's hesitation, hit the green accept button on my steering wheel. "Hello, Davin?" I said. There was no answer from the speakers, though I could tell there was someone on the other end of the line. I could hear someone breathing, very softly. "Davin, hello?" I said. Still no answer. Okay, this is beyond weird, I thought, and began to reach for the red disconnect button when someone spoke. But it wasn't Davin. "Hello, Jared." I felt the blood drain from my face, and my hands gripped the wheel a bit more tightly. Whoever was speaking was using some sort of voice masking software. The same type you'd hear people use on crime programs when they wanted to remain anonymous. It continued. "It's nice to finally speak directly to you." My voice had become lodged in my throat, and for a moment I looked down at the flip phone in the cup holder. I'd programmed Detective Monkhouse's number into it, and I wondered if I could quietly flip it open and speed dial him. I found my voice finally as I slowly took one hand off the steering wheel, watching a beautiful pond flash by on my left. "Who the hell are you, and what the hell do you want?" I said, attempting to sound intimidating, but knowing I failed miserably. The person on the other end laughed. "Oh, come on now, Jared. Where's the fun in spoiling the surprise on that?" It laughed again. "Maybe you'll find out. Then again, maybe you won't." My right hand had made it to the flip phone, and I slowly began to lift it out of the cup holder. That was when the brakes on my car locked up for no reason at all. I was shot forward, the only thing that kept me from smashing into the steering wheel being the seatbelt. The flip phone flew from my hand and landed somewhere I couldn't see as the car began driving again. What the hell was that? I didn't hit the brakes. Jared," the voice through the speakers said. "You ruined the fun for a while by going to the police, and then tried to again when you called them last night." The person clucked their tongue. "I'm not going to have us disturbed this time." It laughed again, and as I reached down, I heard my car let out a beep. Looking back up, I saw something which made the blood in my veins turn to ice. My car is a 2020 Cadillac CT6V. I'd purchased it to treat myself when I'd gotten an extremely nice bonus 2 years ago, as I'd never owned a car as new before. One of the options I'd insisted on finding had been the true hands-free driving system called Super Cruise. And now, as I stared in horror, and even though I knew it was a road it shouldn't have been able to work on, the green glow from the top of the steering wheel indicated that it had been activated. At the same time, I felt the car begin to accelerate, even though my foot wasn't pressing hard down on the accelerator. The voice laughed again. "You'd be amazed at how easy it is to hack into newer cars connected to the internet," it said, almost in a boastful tone. "All it takes is a few keystrokes and whoop." I stared at the speedometer as it passed 80 miles an hour and kept climbing rapidly. "Please stop the car," I begged. All I got was a laugh in return. Then the voice lost all humor in it. "Enjoy the ride, Jared," it said, before the line went dead. The car kept accelerating, now reaching 110 miles an hour. I reached out and frantically tried turning the steering wheel, but it wouldn't move an inch in my hands. All of a sudden, a new sound assaulted my ears. The radio had begun to play music all on its own. I stared at the screen and felt a sick, sinking sensation in my stomach as I recognized both the opening guitar riff and the name displayed on the screen, "Don't Fear the Reaper" by Blue Oyster Cult. In desperation, I began jamming my foot down on the brake pedal, hoping something would happen, but even though it went all the way to the floor, the car only continued to pick up speed. Trees, houses, and lakes went by in an almost indistinguishable blur as the car passed 130 miles an hour, the speedometer almost on the far right side now. The lyrics to the song, one which for all my life I'd loved hearing, now held a sick, sadistic tone to them as the singer belted out the song's title over and over. What the fuck do I do? I didn't know. There wasn't much I could do. I felt tears begin to well up in my eyes as I was pressed back into the seat. That was when a sign whipped by on the right. It was too quick to read, but I'd gone by it so many times that I knew what it had said by now. It was a sign advertising the biggest lake in our town up ahead, along with a parking and viewing space. As the car reached the bend in the road, I expected it to take the turn. But instead, and with a new feeling of terror, the car kept going straight, flying onto and down the narrow dirt and gravel road. I heard rocks and sticks slamming into the car's underside over the roar of the engine. That was when a fresh dose of horror crashed over me like a freezing wave. I knew what they were going to do to me. Directly at the end of the road was the parking lot, which sat behind a wooden fence, separating it from an almost 40 feet drop down to the lake. They're going to drive me right off the edge into the lake. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. "Fuck that!" I shouted out at no one. I knew if I tried bailing out of the car at these speeds on this road, I would sustain serious, possibly even life-threatening injuries, but it was still better than possibly drowning. I made the decision and unbuckled my seatbelt, reaching for the driver's door handle. As soon as my fingers wrapped around the cool aluminum,
I yanked, hard. Nothing happened. The door locks remained firmly down, the door unmoving. I tried again, getting the same thing. "Fuck!" I screamed, then saw the narrow road open up. Beyond it, I saw a few cars parked on the edges, and beyond the thin wooden fence, the shimmering blue waters of the lake. "Oh, fuck me," I breathed out, my words barely audible over the still playing song, which had reached its guitar solo. I scrambled over my shoulder, grabbing the seatbelt and frantically trying to hook it back into place. As it finally clicked, the car burst out of the road into the lot, having slowed down somewhat on the dirt, but still traveling over 100 miles an hour. I saw the panicked faces of people turning to see me, flying towards them, some yanking their children out of the way. I opened my mouth and screamed out as all I saw was the fence. And then, the car was airborne. It smashed through the fence as though it had been made of straw. The front of the car lifted slightly, and all I saw were treetops and the blue sky. At the speed I'd been going, the car made it halfway across the huge lake. And then, everything slammed to a halt as it finally crashed into the water. I flew forward, my head slamming into the steering wheel hard enough that I almost lost consciousness. The airbag didn't deploy, no doubt due to something that fucker had done to it. I pulled back, leaning into the seat as it sat in the water for a moment. I put my hand to my forehead, coming away and seeing bright red blood on the palm. Ugh, I groaned out in pain. Thankfully, the music had died upon impact along with the engine, but worse was that it had been replaced with a new sound. The sound of water filling up the engine compartment through the front grille. In a daze, I reached down and unbuckled the seatbelt, sliding forward slightly towards the wheel again as I was freed. The nose of the car began to sink into the water slowly, and as I regained my wits, panic returned en masse. Oh hell, the car's sinking. I knew I needed to get out now. I turned and grabbed for the door handle, hoping that now, whatever the voice who'd hacked my car had done to it would be useless without power. But the doors remained locked, refusing to open. And without power, the windows wouldn't roll down either. I fought back the rising horror in my mind as I saw water slip over the top of the hood, reaching the bottom edge of the windshield. "Oh crap, oh crap, crap, crap," I mumbled out. Turning and gripping the back of my seat, I leaned forward and looked into the back seat. As my eyes swept over everything, a small glint of metal wedged under the passenger seat caught my eye. Yes! It was a tire iron, one I'd used a few days prior to change a flat tire I'd gotten on the highway. I'd dropped it into the back seat when I'd finished and hadn't bothered to return it to the trunk. Reaching over, I fumbled for a moment, trying to dislodge it from where it had caught, as I felt the car sink, nose first, further into the water. After a few frantic tugs, it finally came free, and I turned around. I let out a sharp cry as I saw the water had slipped over the entire windshield. All I could see out of it now was the blue, slightly murky shadows of underwater. At the same time, I felt something cold begin to splash against my legs, and looked down to see water beginning to pour into the cabin. At that moment, a thought occurred to me. My phone. I frantically fumbled around in the passenger footwell, hoping the water hadn't risen over it yet. Thankfully, I found it just above the rising waterline. Snatching it up, I opened my center console and yanked out a waterproof baggie I'd put in there to hold some miscellaneous items of mine. I upended it, dumping the contents out, then stuffed the phone into it and sealed it, tucking it into my inner jacket pocket. Then I picked up the tire iron and gauged how far I'd have to swing to shatter the driver's window, which, for the moment, still was above the waterline. Information I'd learned when I was younger came to the front of my mind, and I knew I only had a few seconds before the water covered it, making it almost impossible to break. Crying out, I swung as hard as I could. The first blow did nothing to it. I swung again. This time, to my relief, cracks began appearing in the glass. As I saw water begin to creep up the window, I let out a final scream and swung a third time. The window finally shattered into 1,000 pieces of small glass. Almost immediately, water began pouring into the now open window, and the car rapidly began to fill up with water and sink. I grabbed the roof of the car, struggling to pull myself out through the mountain of water pouring in. As the waterline finally reached me, I took one final gasp of air as I sank underwater. The pressure finally equalized, and I pulled myself out of the open window, pushing away from the car with my feet. I stared down for a moment as I watched it sink down, eventually too deep for me to see, then kicked as hard as I could for the surface. After a few agonizing moments, during which my lungs began to feel as though they were on fire, my head broke the surface. I sputtered, coughing out bits of lake water which had made its way into my mouth. The shoes and clothes I had on weighed down, making me feel as though I'd sink again. That's when I felt someone grab me from behind. "Get off me!" I screamed, thrashing around, but the grip didn't loosen. "Easy, easy, I've got you," I heard a man's voice say, and I realized one of the people who'd seen me crash through the fence must have jumped into the water after me. I felt all strength leave me, and I lay back in the water as I was pulled back to shore, where a crowd of 20 or so people had formed. They all had concerned or frightened looks on their faces, and after what they must have seen, I didn't blame them one bit. I heard one woman talking on the phone to the police, and the thought reminded me. I reached into my soaked coat and pulled out the waterproof bag. The guy who'd rescued me saw me pulling it out and crouched down next to me. I held it out to him. "Use it," I muttered weakly. Call Detective." I looked around. I looked at all the people who stood in the hospital lobby, at the ones walking through the parking lot. I saw them all holding up their smartphones, scrolling through whatever, taking photos or talking on them. I saw the cameras for the surveillance system, both in the lobby and on the parking lot lights. I suddenly was overcome with a feeling of being unsafe and watched, the same feeling I'd had twice before, and quickly hurried to the officer's cruiser. For the next few weeks, nothing, again, happened. Everything seemed to mellow out. This time, though, I didn't feel relieved. It felt like whoever had set their eyes on me were just biding their time, waiting for it all to die down. The police and the upper investigatory team. Nobody would tell me how high up they were, but I could guess. Hadn't made any headway into finding the culprit or culprits behind the car hacking and text messages. Whoever it was good, never using one IP address too long to be tracked, and using encryption as well. That was all I was told, anyways. In the meantime, I'd been placed on paid leave by my job, and I mostly stayed home. I'd also purchased a new car with the money my insurance paid out for my Cadillac. This time, however, instead of buying a new car, I'd browsed through Craigslist on my laptop, covering the camera with tape though, until I found an early 70s Ford LTD for sale. One which had no possible connection to the internet to it. I'd bought it immediately. Then, one Thursday, as I stood outside in the warm summer air, washing my new car in the driveway, I saw a van pull up to the curb in front of my house. I felt my heart sink as I saw it was a FedEx truck. A different man from the first time stepped out, carrying a familiar-looking delivery envelope. Feeling my heart begin to thud hard in my chest, I dropped the water hose and sponge and ran around the side of the van. The squad car was still there, and I frantically waved my arms to be spotted. After a second, the two officers stepped out and jogged to me. "What's wrong, sir?" one asked. I couldn't find my voice. Instead, I jabbed towards the delivery man now walking across the front lawn to us. He froze as the officers sped over to him. After a confused moment, he handed them the envelope. While one officer detained him for questioning, the other pulled on a pair of sterile gloves from his pocket and tore open the envelope. Upending it in his hand, 3 items fell out. The first was a local newspaper clipping of the accident I'd been in. It had been laminated, and in the giant front page picture I could see the tail end of my Cadillac being hauled out of the lake.
The second was another glossy photo. It had been taken through the broken fence I'd smashed through. I could see my own unconscious body, surrounded by people. Knowing they'd been that close to me, physically been that close to me, filled me with a fear I can't describe. The third was another typed note. "Congratulations on surviving, Jared. Enjoy your rest. We'll see you again soon.